choosing a partner for life is always a very responsible decision. After all, your chosen one can become your soulmate, true love, or can turn into a living nightmare. This story is about the second case. About how seemingly ordinary people can hide such terrible and dark secrets within themselves that you involuntarily begin to wonder how they can live with it themselves. In 2016, 22-year-old Julia Wright was studying at a medical college in Massachusetts. It was then that she met 18-year-old Brendan Chicklese. Brendan was a student at a technical college, dreaming of becoming a heating and ventilation specialist. Julia and Brendan were complete opposites. The girl looked very extravagant, dressed informally and behaved the same way. But Brendan was a calm and kind guy. He dressed modestly, grew up in an atmosphere of parental care and love. For over 10 years, Brendan was involved in scouting, loved hiking and relaxing in nature. Everyone who knew him well spoke of Brendan as a sensitive and open person. When they started dating, this strange union seemed like a real attraction of opposites. Gradually, their relationship became more intimate, and the girl began to involve Brendan in unusual sexual practices. Given their young age, it was difficult for the couple to find a secluded place for such experiments. So at some point, Julia suggested using a treehouse belonging to her friend for this purpose. The treehouse was abandoned, located in the middle of the forest, but just a few kilometers from the houses where Julia grew up. Over time, her friend stopped visiting this place, and the girl could use it freely. She decorated her makeshift shelter with chains and other attributes, turning it into a kind of base for lovemaking. There she also began to collect her collection of specific objects. By the time Brendan first got to this place, an ominous atmosphere already reigned there, evoking dark thoughts. However, the young man patiently put up with his girlfriend's eccentricities. They regularly met here alone, but as the relationship developed, the guy increasingly realized that they were not a match at all. Eventually he realized that they had no future together. Brendan proposed to break up amicably, and Julia agreed. It seemed that they broke up calmly, showing emotional maturity. In 2018, Brendan was living with his parents in the small town of Rindge, New Hampshire. He got his dream profession as a heating engineer and started dating another girl, Jocelyn Williams. In July, he planned to celebrate his 21st birthday. It seemed that, despite his young age, the guy had already achieved a lot. He had an education, a stable job and a relationship. He sincerely confessed to his loved ones that he had never felt so happy before. Shortly before this, Brendan decided that he already had enough experience to open his own heating systems business. And he began to act in this direction. Everyone supported his initiative: family, friends, girlfriend. They saw that Brendan was exactly the kind of person who could successfully run his own business. Unfortunately, he was never destined to fulfill these dreams. On June 23, 2018, 20-year-old Brendan left home, intending to visit relatives in the town of Wentham, New Hampshire. He had to cover about 50 miles to his destination, a little over an hour's drive. He left home around 1 p.m., but did not reach his relatives even by evening. All attempts to contact the young man were in vain. His parents, girlfriend, grandmother, whom he was heading to visit, all called him. They all began to seriously worry. Such behavior was not at all like Brendan. His cell phone was turned off, although he had never disappeared without communication before. The guy had a tight schedule. A new client could call him at any moment. Unfortunately, to report a person's disappearance to the police, it was necessary to wait at least a day. On the morning of June 24, Brendan's mother and father came to the police station. They described the situation in detail, emphasized that the missing man had never been prone to spontaneous partying with friends. He had no mental disorders and generally had no reason to disappear anywhere. The police began searching for traces of Brendan in Wentham. However, no matter how hard they tried, they could not find any evidence that he ever reached the city. There was not a trace of his car, including on footage from surveillance cameras. In Wentham, Brendan did not buy anything. He did not pay for gasoline with his card and did not get in touch from his phone. 5 days passed in this limbo, without any clues. The missing man's family continued to search for him, but the thought that they would never see their loved one alive again increasingly crept into their heads. Finally, on June 29, Brendan's gray Honda Civic was found abandoned in a shopping center parking lot, 37 miles west of Wenham. It was unclear how the car ended up there. Moreover, it turned out to be unlocked, with keys sticking out of the ignition. This only reinforced the worst suspicions. Brendan would never do this with his property, but such methods are often used by criminals. This allows them to provoke a vehicle theft. Unfortunately, the attempts of the relatives to find the missing young man were unsuccessful, despite all their efforts, handing out flyers in Brendan's hometown and throughout the county in the vicinity. However, on July 10, 2018, an unexpected discovery occurred. A jogger training in the forest near Ringe, just 6 miles from where the missing man's car was left, stumbled upon a chilling find. In the bushes, just a few dozen meters from a busy highway, lay a body wrapped in a tarp, with hands and feet tied with rope. Most of the flesh had time to rot, exposing the bones. Experts who arrived at the scene suggested that this method of concealing the corpse was chosen on purpose to quickly get rid of evidence due to intensive decomposition. It was probably an experienced criminal, well aware of how to avoid punishment, perhaps not for the first time. The discovery of Brendan's shirt nearby, with numerous knife cuts, only intensified these suspicions. Based on these traces, the victim received at least 12 blows, although there could have been more. Confirming the exact number due to the condition of the body was impossible, as was establishing the immediate cause of death or the likelihood of torture prior to it. The phone of the murdered man could also not be found. Obviously it was destroyed or discarded, because since the moment of disappearance no one could connect to it. Another proof that this was the work of a seasoned killer who knows about the danger of any information carriers and means of communication. It really worked. The police could not even track the route of the victim's movement before or after death. However, the investigation still had access to data on the last calls from Brendan's mobile before it was turned off. It turned out that the last call before the disappearance was made near the house of his ex-girlfriend, 24-year-old Julia. Assuming that he could have visited his ex-girlfriend before the trip, the patrol officers went there, and already on the approach they felt an unbearable stench of decomposed flesh. But a real shock awaited inside the dwelling. Rotting animal corpses wrapped in tarpaulin or folded into various containers lay everywhere, along with BDSM paraphernalia, knives, and their photographs. This house surpassed all the worst memories of the cops who first encountered Julia. 24-year-old Julia Enright was living alone in her father's house at the time and working as a lab assistant in a clinical laboratory, a rather respected profession in the USA, which involved collecting blood for tests and preparing samples. The girl had always been distinguished by her peculiarity and eccentricities, which, as it turned out later, went far beyond the limits of normality. Working in the lab was not just a way for Julia to help people and make a living, but something much more. The same hands that took blood from patients during the day belonged to Mistress Jasmine at night, a famous dominatrix in BDSM escort circles. The girl openly told all her friends and acquaintances about her fetish, assuring that it was only a mutually consenting fun, which all clients were delighted with, although in reality no one really guessed the real dangers of this occupation. Despite all the risks of criminal prosecution for prostitution, Julia went all in and even posted an ad on a thematic site, inviting those who wanted to play BDSM games with a knife and blood. Formally, it was supposed to be a light injury and bloodletting with the partner's consent, a specific but quite legal entertainment for lovers of acute sensations. However, in reality, much darker things were hidden behind this screen. Julia always had her skeletons in the closet associated with an unhealthy obsession with blood. The girl saw something more in this red liquid than just a component of the human body. She even used it for painting. But this was only one side of her strange nature. As it turned out, Julia was attracted not only by blood, but also by dead flesh. Julia's dwelling housed a collection of dead animals that she carefully placed in jars, including large specimens like a crow. The inner yard of her house was regularly littered with the bodies of decomposing creatures, which she pre-wrapped in tarpaulin. The heat accelerated the process of decay, and then the bones were used to create unusual and creepy creations. Although for an outside observer it looked like a real nightmare, which was also justified by an unbearable stench, in Julia's opinion, there was a kind of beauty and artistic value in this. Obviously, if Julia's aspirations were not so close to death in the literal sense of the word, she could probably even be considered one of the provocative artists of our time. Unfortunately, her understanding of beauty turned out to be too perverse and cruel to claim an artistic pedestal. Among other things, Julia cherished a whole collection of vials filled with blood, and used condoms. It turned out that she was obsessed with the personalities of Marilyn Manson and serial killers. Moreover, once the girl even told about a peculiar ritual in which she personally took an active part. When a whole company of people gathered, they cut the veins on their arms and really drank a little of each other's blood. Despite all these disturbing and suspicious hobbies, Julia had friends, and she was not ashamed to share her creative works. The girl constantly convinced everyone that she had no talent in art, but this was how she reflected her worldview. Julia systematically demonstrated the remains of dead animals to acquaintances, organizing strange patterns out of them. Of course, the greatest concern was the question of where she got all these corpses from. To such inquiries, Julia always answered laconically, she found everything necessary for this so-called art in the forest or along the sides of roads. The heroine assured that she herself did not harm living beings, but only used the bodies of animals that were already dead, which she came across. Given the fact that in everyday life she behaved extremely calmly and gently, others were inclined to think that this was just some kind of eccentric whim. It was obvious that Julia's closest circle was not aware of the infamous cannibal from Milwaukee, Jeffrey Dahmer. At one time, this sinister figure also began with a similar obsession. He collected dead animals and was obsessed with studying their remains. Dahmer also described his hobby as an alternative worldview or creativity. Just like the heroine of our story, he surrounded himself with frankly creepy things. Naturally, this could not end well. In her diary, Julia scrupulously documented her life and activities, seeing them as a study of her own psyche. It seemed that she was not aware of how strange and audacious her hobby looked from the outside. The girl continued to view her actions from the point of view of art and even spoke somewhat condescendingly about people who did not understand beauty. However, the diary entries contained not only philosophical sketches. The girl described bloodthirstiness as a magical feature of her character and demonstrated an unhealthy attitude towards the phenomenon of death. Almost from the very beginning of keeping a diary, Julia incessantly reflected on her insatiable desire to kill a person. She considered this a manifestation of bloodthirstiness and insatiability, which simultaneously frightened and fascinated the heroine. Again and again, Julia mentioned that hunger that engulfed her entire being from the very thought of homicide urged her to this terrible act. All these shocking details surfaced during the investigation. The deeper the police dug, trying to understand Julia's personality, the more horrified they became by what they saw and read. It became obvious to the investigators that they were dealing with a potential serial killer. The most compelling source of compromising facts turned out to be the girl's cell phone, confiscated for detailed content analysis. It turned out that shortly before Brendan's disappearance, an exchange took place between Julia and her new boyfriend, Jonathan Lent, whom she met around the same period. Both personalities had a rather dark nature, so they were a perfect match for each other. On the day of Brendan's disappearance, Julia sent Jonathan a message in the evening that contained the alarming phrase, "bloodbath." The detectives were especially alarmed by the similarity between the way the murdered Brendan's body was handled and the method that the girl used on dead animals to accelerate their decomposition. Even more suspicious was the message that Julia sent to Brendan himself the day before his disappearance. In it, she asked if he was going to visit her treehouse. The investigation also managed to establish that for several weeks before the murder, the girl actively sought to rekindle a relationship with her ex-boyfriend. It was assumed that the reason for this was the difficulties that had arisen between Brendan and his current girlfriend. In fact, the couple was on the verge of breaking up because of her cheating. This probably allowed Julia to reel Brendan back in. In the end, he agreed to meet her in a kind of BDSM club. Perhaps the young man regarded this visit as a way to get revenge on his unfaithful girlfriend. As soon as the victim accepted the offer, Julia immediately wrote to Jonathan that there was a surprise for him. The eccentric girl's neighbors willingly shared with the police the details of her sexual relationships and preferences. It turns out that she absolutely openly talked about this to everyone around. It seemed that Julia was even proud of her own debauchery in the intimate sphere. Gradually, a business card fell into the hands of detectives, on which the girl advertised her services for organizing games with a knife and blood. There were witnesses claiming that Julia and her new boyfriend enjoyed cutting each other during sex. And the suspect herself, having ended up in the police station for interrogation, began to lay out the whole obscene truth without the slightest shame. Oddly enough, after this conversation, the police officers simply released Julia. It is unclear how, but this person managed to convince the law enforcement officers that, despite all the eccentricities, she was not involved in the murder, and there was no specific evidence against her. Julia admitted that she really planned to meet Brendan on that fateful day, but he never showed up. In the evening, the girls sent him a message, but did not receive a response. One of the policemen decided to check the information and found a correspondence with Brendan in the message history, which the girl did not mention. It followed from the messages that the former lovers did meet. This little lie made the detectives suspect that they were dealing with a manipulator and a liar who needed to be checked more thoroughly. These suspicions were confirmed. The more the police communicated with Julia, the more her story changed. Finally, the girl acknowledged that she had met with Brendan that evening. According to her, after a short conversation, the guy went to buy illegal substances for a party, but never returned, did not answer calls, so she just went home. And this also turned out to be untrue, because Brendan did not use drugs at all. After exposing the lie, the detectives talked to the suspicious girl's neighbors again. They learned about the treehouse in the woods that Julia had turned into a headquarters for BDSM practices. Officers focused on finding this shelter. They managed to get there with Julia's new boyfriend. It was obvious that the treehouse had been thoroughly cleaned, there was even new furniture and a carpet. All this looked suspicious, as if someone was trying to hide the traces of a crime. The carpet in this treehouse seemed especially inappropriate, as did the cleanliness that sharply contrasted with the chains, jars of blood and animal remains around. When the carpet was removed, it became clear that it covered huge washed blood stains. Similar traces were found under the floorboards, on the stairs and the tree trunk. It seems that they tried to hastily wash them off at night and simply covered them with a carpet. By the number and scale of these traces, it was obvious that a person who lost so much blood was dead. Julia insisted that all these stains were from dead animals that she picked up on the street. But after searching her car, blood was also found. The girl denied that Brendan had ever been in the car, and also that she had met him in the treehouse on the day of the disappearance. She continued to refer to her creepy hobby. However, DNA analysis proved that most of the traces belonged to the murdered guy. When Julia was presented with this evidence, she again changed her story. The girl said that after meeting Brendan, they got heavily drunk, the guy went for drugs, and then they met in the treehouse. According to her, her ex-boyfriend attacked her. He demanded sex, but Julia refused because she already had a new boyfriend. But that did not help. Brendan rushed at her and tried to. Julia claimed that at that moment she had no choice. She was lucky to reach for the knife that she always carried on her belt. The girl confessed that she inflicted several stab wounds on the attacker, defending herself. After that, she seemed to fall into shock and could not even move. Julia sat next to the wounded Brendan for about 40 minutes while he bled. She did not call an ambulance, did not call the police, instead asked her new boyfriend to help get rid of the body. Julia was afraid of going to prison for self-defense, because she was sure that no one would believe her. Of course, at this stage, the investigators no longer believed a single word of hers. More than 10 strikes found on the shirt alone is too much for self-defense. The story about the help of a new boyfriend also sounded implausible, because we were talking about a man who the sadist Julia liked. It is unlikely that he was involved only to get rid of the body. Most likely, he also took part in the massacre, but no strong evidence of this was found. Julia finished her story by telling how the body was wrapped in a tarp and thrown on the side of the highway. She insisted that the fabric was used only to mask the remains. Of course, the police assumed that this could have been a practiced method of obtaining human bones for the girl's perverse fantasies. At least, maniacs tend to collect things associated with their crimes. The behavior of the criminal clearly did not resemble self-defense, but indicated an attempt to evade justice. Julia and her boyfriend Jonathan not only got rid of the body, but also destroyed Brendan's phone, tried to erase traces of blood in the treehouse, covered for each other when communicating with the police. The girl had no bruises or signs of struggle. She did not look morally traumatized by the events. Immediately after getting rid of the body, she and Jonathan went to eat sushi. The detectives were finally convinced of their suspicions by Julia's diaries. Judging by the latest entries, she perceived the murder of Brendan as a kind of gift to a new lover with the same perversions. Jonathan, on the other hand, categorically denied his involvement. He claimed that he was frightened and did not report to the police because Julia convinced him not to do so. The girl was sure that she would avoid punishment, which she frankly wrote about in her diary. Moreover, the aspiring maniac admitted that bullying and murder brought her sexual satisfaction. Obviously, she would not have stopped there. Each subsequent entry in the diary was more alarming than the previous one. The notes fully revealed the true nature of Julia's interests. The girl repeatedly desecrated graves, brought bones for her perverse collections. It seemed that her boyfriend was not at all embarrassed by this. Jonathan continued to deny his involvement in the massacre of Brendan. He confirmed Julia's version of the attempted rape. Ironically, Julia first appeared in court on Brendan's 21st birthday. She was charged with intentional murder. Despite the huge amount of evidence against her, she continued to insist that she was a victim of an attack and did not admit guilt in premeditated murder. Jonathan Lent was arrested 2 weeks after Julia's detention. He was charged with concealing traces of a crime and giving false testimony. He also did not plead guilty. Both were placed in prison without the right to bail until trial. The first hearing in Julia's case was scheduled for November 2021. The prosecution argued that the defendant planned the murder of her ex-boyfriend as an act of revenge and an opportunity to fulfill her perverse desires. The girl easily lured Brendan into a trap by promising sex. She probably brutally massacred him, and then involved a new boyfriend to help get rid of the body and traces. Julia's interests went beyond any reasonable limits. It turned out that shortly before the murder, she had an abortion at a family planning clinic. The staff confirmed that the girl was very persistently asking to give her the fetus. She even offered to bribe doctors to take the unborn child home. Obviously, this was supposed to become another exhibit in her collection. The lawyer tried in every possible way to whitewash the image of the defendant and her accomplice, but given all the evidence collected, it was extremely difficult. So the only possible tactic was chosen, to denigrate the victim. The defender argued that Brendan was a cruel and aggressive rapist. It sounded extremely unconvincing. At the trial, Julia, sobbing, told how Brendan attacked her. She claimed that she was able to protect her honor only by hitting the guy in the throat with a knife. But she could not explain why she inflicted numerous other injuries. Despite the desperate attempts of the lawyer to protect his client, the prosecutor managed to paint a truly nightmarish image of Julia. The jury was adamant and found her guilty, but not of intentional murder, but of second-degree murder, considering the crime unplanned. In March 2022, the court passed a sentence, life imprisonment with the possibility of parole in 25 years. Hearing the decision, the girl cried again and through tears said that not a day goes by that she does not regret meeting Brendan Chicklese. Julia never admitted guilt, calling the outcome of the process a misunderstanding. 29-year-old Jonathan Lent, found guilty of providing false testimony, was sentenced to imprisonment for a term of 7 to 9 years. Pregnancy is a period of serious challenges for a woman's body, primarily due to radical hormonal changes capable of causing unpredictable shifts in emotional state. But can these physiological factors serve as mitigating circumstances in the case of a newborn baby's murder? Melissa Drexler was born on July 10, 1978, in the small town of Lacey, located in New York State. She was an only child. Later, her parents and daughter moved to Forked River in New Jersey. This suburb had approximately 5,000 residents during the period of the events described. The Drexler family was well known in the area, particularly because Melissa's parents were considered quite wealthy and successful for this suburb. Her mother held a position as an administrator in a banking institution, while her father worked as a manager in a reputable logistics firm. The family was respected in society, lived comfortably, and even managed to purchase a spacious house after moving. At the same time, the Drexlers never flaunted their prosperity. On the contrary, they were known for their modesty and held conservative views, including those related to religion. The couple practiced Christian values and tried to instill them in their daughter. From an early age, Melissa was a very quiet, calm, and somewhat solitary girl. In elementary school, she found it difficult to make new acquaintances, yet she did not allow herself to be bullied. Instead, the schoolgirl gathered a few friends around her, with whom she maintained friendly communication. The situation changed somewhat in 4th grade when Melissa befriended Rebecca Johnson. This friendship helped bring out more active traits in her character. Following her friend's example, Melissa began taking dance lessons and achieved success in the jazz style, which was fashionable at that time. In all other respects, she remained the same Melissa, a modest and reserved girl. By the start of middle school, she still maintained a small circle of acquaintances and friends. She rarely communicated with outsiders and didn't make new friends. Most people characterized Melissa as an ordinary girl who was never particularly popular among classmates, didn't cause problems, was quiet, very calm, and sweet in appearance. Often such a temperament is characteristic of top students, but Melissa couldn't boast of outstanding academic achievements, her performance was mediocre. According to Rebecca, Melissa expressed herself more as a devoted friend. Despite difficulties in establishing new acquaintances, she communicated warmly with her longtime friends, supported them, and was gentle and caring. The girl was not particularly sociable, but she knew how to listen and support with any problem. When it came to her own emotions, Melissa showed remarkable restraint, was not prone to exuberant merriment, and even a well-aimed joke could rarely make her laugh. It seemed that Melissa was simply incapable of responding violently, making scenes, or creating problems. On the contrary, even the most active girls, after getting to know and becoming close to her, became more moderate and calm, following her example. Melissa, like other teenagers in the mid-90s, didn't have access to the internet, social networks, or modern entertainment. Even video games and computers hadn't become as widespread as they are today. So Melissa spent most of her free time with friends at the shopping mall in the neighboring, larger city. Here were the arcade games and favorite fashion stores that attracted the girls most. Melissa especially loved them, as she dreamed of working in the fashion and design industry. The group of friends could spend all day at the mall, taking breaks only to snack at the food court. All the teenagers in the town often met and relaxed here. So it's not surprising that it was in this place that the fateful acquaintance of the heroine of this story took place, which radically changed her entire life. Melissa never liked to openly discuss herself or anyone else, always remaining very secretive. This trait sometimes seemed unmotivated and became especially noticeable when, at the age of 16, she met a boy named John Lewis. Presumably, she didn't seek publicity since he was older than her, and their communication and meetings could have provoked disapproval. As expected, the acquaintance with the young man happened at the mall, and initially, only Rebecca knew about it. Her best friend called this meeting fateful, as its consequences turned not only Melissa's life and her immediate surroundings upside down, but also affected the entire town. It wasn't like an explosion of emotions or a wild infatuation, rather, it resembled an ordinary teenage romance. The couple was similar in many aspects, remained very calm and reserved, their communication and relationship developed gradually. After a few weeks of regular friendly meetings, it became evident that the young man was not indifferent to Melissa. The young people began dating, but their relationship was peculiar, with periodic misunderstandings that her friends attributed to the age difference. The smallest arguments led to breakups. However, once the couple cooled down, they got back together. It looked like typical immature relationships. Everyone who knew about the situation was convinced that this couple wouldn't last longer than until the end of high school. After some time, most classmates learned about Melissa's romance with the older boy, but she didn't want to inform her parents. The girl was most afraid that her mother and father, due to their conservative religious views, would oppose this relationship. Additionally, problems could arise due to her boyfriend's age. However, hiding from relatives wasn't difficult, as her mother and father worked a lot, spending minimal time at home. Both were very busy. When they were home, the girl would simply say after school that she was going to the library or meeting friends at the mall. They would let her go without concern. In reality, during this period, she secluded herself with her boyfriend at his place. The girl always returned around 7 p.m., not breaking curfew. Therefore, her parents didn't scold her, noticing nothing unusual. And when they weren't home, she tried to return even earlier, before her parents came back from work, so they wouldn't notice her absence at all. This scheme worked flawlessly. Her parents really knew nothing about her relationship with the boy, despite the fact that Melissa spent 90% of her free time with John. In reality, many couldn't understand why such confidentiality was necessary. In particular, Rebecca repeatedly asked her friend this question. She never received a convincing answer. But it was obvious that Melissa was afraid of something. Her surroundings saw that she had warm relationships with her parents, especially with her mother. They often relaxed together, went to the mall, amusement park on weekends, spent time together on weekdays when there was a free hour. However, the girl continued to hide, reluctantly talking about her boyfriend even to her closest friends. Rebecca convinced herself that it was all related to the Drexler's religiosity. Melissa herself remained religious, which, however, didn't prevent the 16-year-old girl from having an active sex life with her boyfriend. All this led to a natural result. In the fall of 1996, Melissa noticed a delay in her menstruation. At first, the girl wasn't too concerned about it, but when a whole month passed and the delay showed no signs of disappearing, she began to worry. Melissa wasn't naive and understood what this could mean. When suspicions about pregnancy became too real, the high school student decided to take a test. To her great regret, the result was positive. At the end of November 1996, Melissa dared to talk face-to-face with John and tell him about the situation. The girl expressed the assumption that she had become pregnant by her boyfriend, as they didn't use contraception. The young man was shocked by this news, as Melissa had always assured him that she was taking birth control pills. He didn't even suspect that in reality, the girl never resorted to them, fearing side effects. After waiting for John's reaction to the news about the delay, Melissa realized that he wasn't at all thrilled with what he heard. So she just laughed and said it was just a joke, saying that she had confused the dates. Of course, there was no mistake. Simply because of the boy's negative reaction, the heroine of the story decided to hide the real state of affairs in order not to lose him. As often happens in such situations, Melissa just hoped that the problem would somehow resolve itself, although this was certainly impossible. When the girl was already in her 4th month of pregnancy, the first signs of her delicate condition appeared: nausea and an enlarging belly. But even then, she stubbornly remained silent, preferring not to seek support and to hide her condition. In the following months, Melissa tried to behave as usual, but some close friends noticed changes in her usual preferences. Now she ate products that she previously couldn't stand. The girl began consuming much more food, snacking more often, which was uncharacteristic for her. It was visible to the naked eye that she had gained a few kilograms, but no one dared to say anything. Everyone just thought that due to hormonal restructuring, Melissa had gained a little weight, and they didn't want to upset her. To hide her growing belly, the girl began wearing baggy clothes, jeans, hoodies that didn't hug her figure, and also wrapped her stomach. This also didn't correspond to her usual style. But the high school student managed to convince everyone that she was embarrassed by her excess weight and was going to fight it. These excuses worked without fail. Gradually, the talk subsided, and besides, not everyone in the girl's immediate circle was attentive enough. For example, her friend Sarah had lunch with Melissa every day at school and didn't notice anything unusual at all. Why her parents also didn't suspect anything remained a mystery. In this state, Melissa waited until spring. The senior class began preparing for the school prom, scheduled for June 1997. By the end of May, the girl should have had a fairly large belly, which would be hard not to notice. Despite this, she went with her best friend Rebecca and her mom Lynn to the mall to choose dresses for prom. The girls tried on the prettiest options. During the day, each of them changed several times, but none of Melissa's companions noticed anything suspicious. Later, remembering this episode, they emphasized that the belly wasn't noticeable at all, although the girl was in a delicate condition. Melissa, about 5 feet 3 inches in height, looked only slightly fuller, quite normal. She chose looser styles, so no one even suspected that the girl was about to give birth. By the way, Melissa had always been interested in fashion and designer clothes. Therefore, for the summer period, she even got a job as a sales consultant in a women's clothing store on the coast. At that time, she dreamed of going to New York and becoming a famous designer. However, she lacked enthusiasm to implement this idea, so the girl dared to apply to a college in a neighboring city, located 45 minutes from her home. Those who knew Melissa well noted her talent for drawing and design, but her written work and academic performance in other important subjects were failing. This in no way corresponded to her plans for the future. However, this situation could have been due to the fact that during this period, the girl's thoughts were occupied with completely different things, particularly how to hide a rather large pregnancy term. And finally, June 6, 1997, arrived, the long-awaited day of the prom. Like other young men and women from the town, Melissa was busy with preparations from early morning. She went to a beauty salon to have her hair and makeup done. No one even suspected that throughout the day, the girl was experiencing severe pains in her stomach, which she was trying with all her might not to pay attention to. Even then, she believed that everything would pass on its own. In the evening, Melissa Drexler, along with her boyfriend John and her best friend Rebecca, got into a limousine. Ahead was a trip to the banquet hall in the neighboring town of Aberdeen, New Jersey, where the prom was to be held. Throughout the journey, the 18-year-old girl was suffering from some strange spasms in her stomach. When they reached the parking lot, she was all sweaty and breathing heavily. Rebecca and John were worried about their friend's condition, kept asking her questions, even offered to go to a doctor instead of the prom. But Melissa wasn't going to ruin the graduation evening and assured them that these were just strong menstrual cramps that would soon pass. Even then, her best friend had no idea that for the last 9 months, Melissa had been carrying a child, and she was in labor. As soon as all the youth entered the banquet hall, the girl immediately rushed to the women's restroom, explaining that she needed to freshen up. Other graduates only managed to catch a glimpse of Melissa, but they remembered her beautiful velvet dress. Behind the door of one of the ladies' room stalls, Melissa was giving birth. Other female graduates were also present, who heard some strange sounds, despite the fact that the girl was restraining the pain with all her might and trying not to give herself away. Those present thought that some couple had decided to be alone in the restroom. About 20 minutes passed, and Rebecca, surprised that her friend still hadn't come out, went after her. She approached the stall and asked when she would finally join the group. Concerned about Melissa's well-being, the girl still heard in response that everything was fine and she would come out soon. As soon as Rebecca left the restroom, Melissa again made several incomprehensible sounds. A couple of girls who still remained inside peeked under the door of the stall. But instead of 2 pairs of feet, they saw only one and drops of blood on the floor. There was no answer to their question about what was happening. The frightened high school girls ran out to find some adults and tell them everything. A few more minutes passed. Melissa, as if nothing had happened, returned to the banquet hall and joined her boyfriend and friends on the dance floor. Her absence lasted about half an hour. The girl demonstrated a high spirit, looked completely normal. She even ate some salad, drank punch, and went dancing with other guests at the ball. And then she approached the DJ and asked him to play her boyfriend's favorite song, The Unforgiven, by Metallica. Meanwhile, two girls who noticed blood in the toilet stall approached the teachers present at the prom. They told them about the disturbing find in the restroom. When one of the high school teachers entered there, she saw only blood smeared on the walls of the stall. Since there was no one nearby with signs of injury, the incident was written off as a bad joke. To avoid spoiling the mood at the celebration, it was decided to simply send a cleaner to tidy up the toilet. When the banquet hall employee entered the stall, she was shocked by the bloody scene. There was blood on the walls, on the toilet lid, on the floor. In the toilet itself, the woman saw some bloody bundle, which she simply threw in the trash, not even suspecting that it was the placenta. Not fully understanding what had happened, the cleaner wiped the blood with paper towels and threw them in the bin. But it turned out to be already overflowing. The woman tried to lift the garbage can to empty it, but it seemed surprisingly heavy. Then she called a colleague, and together they pulled out some dark package from the bin. It was at this moment that the prom organizer learned that one of the girls had fallen ill. She approached Melissa and asked about the blood in the toilet, expressing concern about her well-being. But the girl just brushed it off, assuring that she was fine, and the incident was caused by a difficult menstruation. At this time, the cleaner tore open the suspicious package from the garbage and found the body of a newborn baby inside. News of the terrible find instantly spread to all students and organizers of the celebration. Those present were shocked, as no one even suspected that Melissa had been pregnant all this time. Even her best friends and boyfriend John insisted that this was some kind of misunderstanding, as they would have definitely noticed a pregnancy. When persistent inquiries began to be addressed to the girl, Melissa admitted that it was her child, whom she had given birth to in the toilet stall. After this confession, an ambulance was immediately called, and the girl, along with the baby, was urgently taken to the local hospital, hoping that the child could be saved. At this time, Melissa's parents were peacefully spending a quiet Friday evening at home, reminiscing about their own prom and waiting for their daughter's return. Instead, they received a phone call informing them that Melissa had just given birth. At first, they decided it was some kind of mistake but still went to the hospital, not fully believing what they had heard. In the ward, they saw their daughter, pale as a sheet, exhausted, lying on a hospital bed. And at this time, in the emergency department, doctors were desperately fighting for the life of the boy she had given birth to. But despite 2 hours of extraordinary efforts, they couldn't save the child. Police officers questioned the young mother, who claimed that the child was born dead, blue, and not breathing. But the autopsy conducted later disproved Melissa's words. The boy's lungs contained air, which meant he was breathing after birth. The medical examiner confirmed that the infant was not stillborn, as the new mother claimed. But the most horrifying details were yet to come. During the examination, the child was found to have injuries to the respiratory tract characteristic of suffocation, as well as marks on the neck, indicating strangulation by hands. In an instant, Melissa transformed from an innocent victim of circumstances into a cruel infanticide of a newborn baby. This story shook the American media, and accusations and real persecution rained down on the girl's family. Journalists dubbed Melissa the prom mom killer. People openly expressed their outrage, and even the girl's school locker had inscriptions like, "Baby Killer." Uncomfortable questions were posed not only to the family but also to teachers and Melissa's closest circle. Everyone was concerned with one thing: how could they not have noticed the pregnancy for 9 months? But most questions were addressed specifically to the Drexler family. Melissa's parents were accused of everything, from banal inattention to their daughter to frankly cruel treatment of her. However, no one could provide evidence of the latter. After all, both were decent and respected people who always treated their daughter with understanding. They worked so much that they weren't even aware of her relationship with the boy, let alone her sexual life. Probably due to constant busyness, they simply didn't notice how Melissa's belly started to grow. Her parents couldn't understand why their daughter didn't tell them about the pregnancy during all 9 months, why she didn't confide in them. After all, they assured that despite their religiosity and conservatism, they would have supported her. But Melissa herself, apparently, was too afraid of their disapproval. Now in the eyes of the public, the girl's parents turned into the same criminals as their daughter, the infanticide. Although, of course, not everyone believed their words, especially against the backdrop of media efforts, which made real monsters out of the Drexler couple. On June 24, a few weeks after the horrible incident, Melissa was arrested on charges of murdering the infant. However, she was soon released on a $50,000 bail. The girl was at home awaiting court hearings, but society craved severe punishment for her horrific crime. Many people even demanded the death penalty, so the Drexler family was seriously concerned for their own safety. During this period, they received threatening phone calls almost daily, as well as letters with warnings of reprisal. Almost all friends and close ones turned away from Melissa, ceasing any communication with her. Even her best friend Rebecca broke off all contacts for a long time. Only John continued to support the girl, assuring that he didn't blame her for the child's death and believed that she herself became a victim of a tragic set of circumstances. He even discussed the possibility of marrying Melissa when she was exonerated, and said that he loved her despite everything. Their wedding was planned for the summer of 1998. In society, opinions were divided. Some considered Melissa a soulless killer of her own child. Others saw her as a frightened girl who, due to her fear and apprehension of condemnation from those close to her and the community, made a terrible mistake. During this period, Melissa underwent several psychiatric evaluations, which revealed signs of a dissociative disorder in her. This condition is quite common among teenagers who become pregnant at an early age. It is characterized by the future mother's complete denial of pregnancy due to strong fear. She tries with all her might to hide her condition and perceives the unborn child as something alien and unnatural. And one of the manifestations of this disorder is the young mother's firm conviction that the child was born dead, even if in reality this is not the case. Melissa proved unable to fully explain her behavior, instead referring to the dissociative disorder. She tried with all her might to hide the pregnancy in the late terms, tightly bandaging her belly so it wouldn't protrude, and continuing to convince herself that all this would soon end. The girl's lawyer argued that she shouldn't be kept behind bars, as such a step was incompatible with her mental state. In his opinion, Melissa rather needed specialized treatment, not imprisonment. From the very beginning of the process, the defender tried to explain the actions of his client as insanity. Meanwhile, the medical examiner insisted that the child was strangled after birth. According to him, Melissa traumatized the respiratory tract of the infant, who was trying to breathe but couldn't, dying despite the efforts of doctors. The prosecution suggested that after the birth of a healthy boy, he might have made sounds in the toilet, and Melissa was scared of being exposed by other girls who were prettying up there. Confused, the hapless mother simply strangled the child to finally hide the pregnancy and the fact of childbirth. Then she cut the umbilical cord with the sharp edge of a metal napkin container, packed the body in a bag, and without any remorse, threw the baby in the trash. Then the girl freshened up to avoid raising unnecessary questions and returned to the banquet hall. The prosecutor insisted that Melissa committed the crime while being of sound mind. This was evidenced not only by her consistent and well-thought-out actions but also by her manner of communication after the discovery of the child's body. During the questioning by detectives, Melissa behaved calmly, collected, and restrainedly, which also confirmed her sanity after killing the infant. At the time of the crime, the girl was already 18 years old, so she was fully aware of the consequences of her actions. Law enforcement and the media portrayed her as a real monster, willing to go to any lengths in order not to spoil the prom. Few witnesses testified on Melissa's side, among them her best friend Rebecca. The girl believed that the boy most likely was born already without signs of life, blue, and not breathing, so the frightened graduate simply decided to get rid of the body. But whatever the case, the situation was extremely serious. the 20-year-old girl faced up to 50 years behind bars if she was found guilty of premeditated murder. Salvation for Melissa was a plea deal, which she concluded on October 29, 1998, admitting her guilt in manslaughter with aggravating circumstances. In a thin girlish voice, with an indifferent expression on her face, the defendant told that she indeed concealed the pregnancy from everyone. According to her, on the morning of prom day, her water broke. Contractions started on the way, but she held on with all her might, not showing any signs. But the pain was becoming unbearable, and the girl could barely endure it. When their company arrived at the banquet hall, Melissa immediately ran to the toilet, where the childbirth began. The child was born alive, but the defendant wrapped him in several packages and threw him in the trash. Melissa admitted that she perfectly understood the consequences of her actions. She realized that the baby would suffocate and die. But the fear of exposure turned out to be stronger than everything else, so she killed her own son. The judge noted that Melissa is not some kind of monster and deserves understanding and compassion. At the same time, he emphasized, the defendant took a defenseless life, so she must accept the consequences and bear punishment. According to the plea deal, the girl was sentenced to 15 years in prison. She even retained the right to parole, which could be obtained after just 3 years. After the verdict was announced, John and Melissa broke up. However, the young man remained close to the Drexler family, often communicating with the girl's parents during her imprisonment, supporting them. Melissa was sent to a New Jersey state prison, where she began to pursue education in the fashion field. She didn't abandon her dream of building a career in this industry, so she took clothing design courses. Many were struck by Melissa's behavior during the trial. It seemed that nothing had happened for her. She felt no remorse for killing her own child. Obviously, the infant's tragedy most affected the girl's parents. The Drexler couple, along with John, held a small memorial service, baptizing the deceased boy Christopher. But after this, they decided to move on with their lives. 3 years later, on October 26, 2001, Melissa was released from prison. The girl was incredibly lucky. Just 3 days after her release, a law came into effect requiring those convicted of violent crimes to serve at least 85% of their term before becoming eligible for parole. If Melissa had fallen under the new standards, she would have had to spend another 9 years behind bars. However, new challenges awaited the girl upon her release. The town's residents remembered her story and weren't going to forgive. Melissa was closely watched, and people were outraged when they saw her on the street accompanied by relatives. People noted that the girl never showed emotions or repentance for killing her newborn. However, Melissa herself seemed to pay no attention to ill-wishers and tried to start a new life, to build her own happiness. There were also those who supported her, believing that the girl really suffered from a dissociative disorder, which determined her behavior. These people believed that Melissa deserved a second chance. But most agreed that for the murder of a newborn, the girl got off with too light a punishment and actually got away with it. However, the heroine of this story herself decided to ignore the negativity from the public and focus on building her future life. She entered into a relationship with a new boyfriend and gave birth to 2 children. Almost nothing is known about Melissa's current life. She avoids excessive publicity, leads a reclusive lifestyle, and doesn't give interviews. Melissa Drexler's story became an exemplary case for young mothers in America. Local residents and school teachers often referred to it to demonstrate what the inattention of others and one's own fears can lead to. This story gained particular resonance in the girl's hometown. Most people who communicated with Melissa and her family before the incident turned away from the Drexlers, and their relationships never became the same. Morgan experienced a horrifying realization about who she had spent most of her life with when her husband Rodney first raised his hand against her. It was a turning point in their relationship. She had always known him as a kind and sensitive man who even refused to watch movies depicting violence against women. Rodney positioned himself as a fighter for women's rights. So when he hit her during an argument at the lake, it came as a real shock to Morgan. It happened during one of their shared weekends when the couple was boating together. They had a fight on the water, and when they returned to the cabin, the man attacked his wife with his fists. Several strong blows rained down on Morgan, who did not expect such fury from her beloved. Rodney had always been against physical violence, so his outburst of aggression was completely unexpected. Immediately after the incident, the shocked woman called her father and begged him to take her away from the lake house. When the man arrived, Rodney vehemently denied hitting his wife. However, his father-in-law saw with his own eyes the traces of beatings on his daughter's face. The former fighter for women's rights instantly turned into a brutal abuser. But Rodney didn't stop there. He began to demonstrate his manipulative nature. Somehow, he managed to convince all of Morgan's friends that she had given herself the bruises to smear him. The man claimed that during the heat of the argument, his wife began to hit herself, leaving marks on her face. And he only tried to restrain her from this madness and could accidentally leave a few bruises. Rodney went even further in his manipulations. He talked to Morgan for hours until he convinced her that she was partly to blame for the incident. The woman really began to doubt herself and feel guilty. From that moment on, the man constantly used this tactic. He worked on his wife until she believed that the quarrels and problems in their family were happening because of her. Rodney even blamed Morgan for his professional troubles. He claimed that because of her, he began to have problems at work. In reality, he lost his job himself, and his wife was forced to take on 2 jobs to provide for the family. But despite the financial difficulties, the man did not appreciate her efforts and only got irritated and lashed out at his loved ones. During this period, the violence against Morgan intensified. In addition to psychological pressure, she also suffered from her husband's sexual harassment. It became unbearable to endure this. Therefore, in 2020, the woman decided to put an end to the abuse and filed for divorce. In December of the same year, the marriage was officially dissolved. The realization came to Morgan with a terrifying understanding of who she had shared a significant part of her life with. Without wasting any time, she called her father, begging him to take her away from the cottage by the lake. When he arrived at the scene, Morgan's husband denied the fact of physical abuse. He then demonstrated the full depth of his manipulative nature. Somehow, he managed to convince his wife's friends that she had given herself the bruises to smear him. According to the man, during the argument, Morgan hit herself in the face, leaving marks. Allegedly, he could have accidentally left a few bruises while only trying to restrain her from this crazy behavior, exclusively for her own good. But the manipulator did not stop there. After lengthy conversations with his wife, he was able to convince even her that she was partly to blame for that incident. Since then, such tactics became usual for him. He worked on Morgan, gradually inclining her to think that she was the cause of the problems and quarrels in their family. The man even blamed his wife for his own career troubles. Meanwhile, the abuse of Morgan only intensified. In addition to psychological pressure, she suffered from sexual violence. But this could not go on forever. In 2020, the woman decided to put an end to it and filed for divorce. This decision immediately brought relief, and in December 2020, the marriage was officially dissolved. Morgan wanted to move on, but she could not completely break away from her ex-husband. They had children together. The couple did not divide custody through the court but agreed on everything verbally. They remained on good terms to traumatize the children less. The former spouses maintained close contact and even traveled together to Morgan's sister in Florida on the eve of Christmas. Both insisted that although their marriage had ended, they got along great for the sake of the children. But suddenly, at the end of the year, Morgan was attacked. Early in the morning on January 1, 2021, Morgan's ex-husband drove up to her house. After knocking on the door and not getting an answer, he walked around, thinking she was still asleep and loudly calling her name. Suddenly, the man noticed Morgan on the back porch. She was lying half-naked on the terrace with her hands tied behind her back. A pillowcase was over her head. She had obviously suffered greatly. Approaching, he administered first aid to Morgan and tried to find out what had happened. Then he called 911 for emergency services. Arriving at the scene, the police found that the woman had been subjected to brutal treatment, rape and beating. She was extremely frightened and could barely talk about what she had experienced. According to Morgan, that night a stranger in a black mask broke into her house. He attacked her and beat her violently. He choked her several times until she lost consciousness and then raped her. The attacker threatened to kill her and even her ex-husband, who was no longer living with Morgan at that time. In the presence of relatives who were already on the scene, the police began to unravel what had happened and recorded the testimony of the young woman. Morgan had planned to celebrate this New Year's Eve with her best friend and business colleague Nicole. After drinking a glass of champagne, the woman felt very tired from the upheavals she had just experienced. So she decided to go home to go to bed early. The friends argued a little about this, but the heroine of the story insisted that she needed rest and recuperation. At that time, Morgan's 8-year-old children were staying with her parents. So for her, this was a good opportunity to get a good night's sleep for the first time in several weeks. The woman returned to her house, turned on the alarm, and went to rest. She woke up in the middle of the night in her bedroom with the feeling of someone else's presence. In the doorway, Morgan noticed a dark silhouette. At first, it seemed to her that it was only a ghost. But upon closer inspection, she realized that it was not a dream. The man was dressed in black and wore a mask resembling a Batman mask. The tall figure looked very sinister. The stranger stood with clenched fists, as if about to attack. A gun appeared in his hand. He pounced on the defenseless woman, hitting her with the weapon and then several times with his fist in the face. Turning Morgan onto her stomach, he pulled her hands behind her back, using plastic ties for bonds. Despite the woman's pleas to let her go, the intruder did not listen. Instead, he uttered a few phrases about how she would regret what she had done. However, he did not give any details about the motive. Morgan felt that the stranger was deliberately changing his voice, imitating Batman in accordance with his outfit. The most terrifying for the victim were the beatings and strangulation. Several times she lost consciousness, and when she came to her senses, everything was repeated again. The woman was sure that she would not survive this night. The criminal was torturing her. One of Morgan's most frightening memories was the moments when the attacker brought her to the brink of life and death, barely allowing her to breathe. The woman described that in those moments, she seemed to be experiencing an out-of-body experience, observing the torture of her body as if from the side. Her thoughts were with her children and husband. She regretted not having time to make a will. Meanwhile, the beating and rape continued. The criminal did not spare the baton in his fists. Morgan could not imagine who could have wished to do something so cruel to her. But deep down, she had a hunch. The dark clothing and altered voice were meant to hide the identity of the attacker, which was probably familiar to her. The experienced detectives shared this hypothesis. But Morgan was especially alarmed by the threats against her ex-husband, from whom she had recently divorced. During one of the strangulations, the attacker hissed through his teeth that she would have to mourn for Rodney. A shocking guess flashed through Morgan's mind: what if it was Rodney himself? Deciding to play the usual psychological game with him, she began to beg not to harm her husband, saying that she loved him very much. And then an amazing twist happened: the beating stopped. The attacker left the woman on the bed and began rummaging through the room in search of valuables. Morgan realized that she had managed to save her life. The criminal no longer acted like a murderer. Now he was only interested in money and jewelry. But before escaping, he took the woman's mobile phone and password, probably to erase the video from the surveillance cameras. Finally, the attacker dragged Morgan into the backyard, throwing a pillowcase over her head. He ordered her to lie still until she heard 2 car signals, threatening to return and shoot her if she disobeyed. The frightened woman lay there for over half an hour, afraid to move. She didn't hear any signals but suspected that the criminal might be lurking nearby. The terrible waiting continued. In a remote area of the city, no one would have heard her screams. But suddenly, Morgan heard footsteps and noise. Was the attacker changing his mind and coming back to kill her? The footsteps stopped nearby, and the woman heard Rodney's familiar voice. Her ex-husband discovered Morgan bound in plastic ties and with a bag over her head around 2 in the morning. They had not arranged to meet, and the children were with their grandparents. Rodney's appearance at that very moment seemed highly suspicious to Morgan. Nevertheless, the woman held on. She feigned hysteria and began to beg Rodney to stay with her and call for help. In fact, Morgan wanted to keep the suspect until the police arrived. When the 911 call went out and the patrol officers headed to the victim's home, Rodney was already waiting in his car near the house. This seemed strange to the cops. Why didn't the man stay with his beaten wife until help arrived? To the interrogation, Rodney responded with a romantic story. He said he was celebrating New Year's Eve alone and was missing Morgan when he suddenly saw a strange young man writing her name on the foggy window. This alarmed him so much that after several unsuccessful attempts to reach her, he felt something was wrong and rushed to his ex-wife, fortunately living only a 15-minute drive away. The investigators began to examine the crime scene. Morgan was brutally beaten, her eye was swollen and barely opened. The nature of the injuries indicated the attacker's emotionality, his personal resentment or anger towards the victim, and not just an ordinary robbery or intrusion by a random criminal. Morgan's father and brother arrived at the scene. The police decided to question all those present separately. As soon as the woman was alone with the officer, away from relatives and Rodney, she made a shocking confession. According to Morgan, it was her ex-husband who attacked her, and now he was pretending to be a savior to deflect suspicion. The woman described the course of events in detail, especially emphasizing the moment when she declared her love for Rodney and the beating abruptly stopped. She recognized his touch when he carried her to the porch. Morgan confessed that she had purposely begged Rodney to stay with her, afraid to directly accuse him of the crime, so that he would not kill her, hiding the traces. Psychologically, it seemed plausible, because the most dangerous period for a woman who had been in a toxic relationship for a long time was immediately after the breakup. As it turned out, the entire first week after the divorce, Rodney obsessively pursued Morgan, trying to manipulate her with pity. The situation took a sinister turn on New Year's Eve. Rodney showed Morgan a doctor's note, as if he had been diagnosed with cancer. Given the recent death of his brother from leukemia and his father's battle with cancer, this aroused considerable sympathy in the woman. However, the pity did not grow into anything more. Rodney tried to get closer to Morgan on an emotional level, using his feelings as leverage. The woman even let him live in her house. But after just a few days, Rodney began to insistently persuade her to resume the relationship, pressing on pity and resorting to manipulation. By December 31st, Morgan finally saw the light and decided to completely cut ties with him and stop supporting him. Rodney was forced to return to his apartment. But less than a day passed when the woman was subjected to a terrible attack. The day before, the man once again tried to convince her to give their relationship a second chance, even claiming to have found a new high-paying job for his wife's sake. At the end of the year, he slipped a check for $56,000 under the door. Interestingly, it was this very check that was later stolen by the intruder who attacked Morgan. Too many coincidences to consider it an accident. Recounting all these facts to the police, the woman was most concerned that the detectives might believe the words of her manipulative ex-husband and not her. This had happened before, even with close people. So when one of the investigators remarked that her story sounded convincing and Rodney should be thoroughly checked, it was a great relief for Morgan. The detectives set about exposing the suspect's lies by verifying each of his statements. They started with the claim about repeated attempts to call his wife before arrival. Morgan denied receiving any calls. And when examining Rodney's mobile phone, no outgoing calls were found. Instead, numerous photos of the ex-wife's naked body were found on the phone, taken secretly without her knowledge. Judging by the dates, Rodney had systematically photographed Morgan for a whole week while living with her after reporting his illness. There were also numerous screenshots of her phone with personal correspondence with other men. These photographs clearly indicated stalking and confirmed the victim's words. Morgan assured that she had no idea about the existence of such photos and never gave permission to be photographed. The mere presence of these facts was enough to bring charges of a serious violation of privacy. Rodney was detained as the main suspect in the attack. He feigned shock and outrage. A check of Morgan's phone revealed that the criminal had deleted all recordings from the house's surveillance cameras. This also indirectly pointed to Rodney's guilt. A random robber would hardly have known about the victim's security system and how to use it. And under other circumstances, he would rather have chosen a less protected target. It was also strange how the intruder managed to sneak inside unnoticed without triggering the alarm. There were sensors on the doors and windows, but none detected a break-in. All systems were working properly, except for a single sensor on a window leading to the basement. It was through this window that the attacker got in. Probably, Rodney deliberately shifted the sensor when he stayed with Morgan after the divorce, planning the attack. The very next day after the arrest, the cops conducted a search of the suspect's house with a warrant. They found even more indirect evidence of involvement. Rodney's browser history revealed many alarming queries: how long does it take to strangle a person to unconsciousness without a lethal result, how to change one's voice. The man even read a book on psychological techniques for influencing women called 7 Ways to Become a Hero to Your Wife. The medical certificate that Rodney showed Morgan as confirmation of the cancer diagnosis turned out to be fake. He created an email account in the name of a non-existent doctor to send himself a forged medical report. During the interrogations, Rodney found excuses for every exposed detail. After the first interrogation, the investigators concluded that there was not enough evidence against the main suspect. He was released, but the investigation continued. The biggest problem for Rodney was the plastic ties found in his apartment. He had specially modified them, cutting them in a certain way to get improvised handcuffs that could be quickly put on and fixed. A whole pack of such items was found. Some of the sets were modified exactly like those that were removed from Morgan's hands. The coincidence seemed too obvious. When asked about the ties, Rodney claimed that he didn't have them at all and had never bought them. He said that someone could have planted them to frame him. The suspect's words needed verification. The detectives began to visit local hardware stores. The same day, they found a video recording of Rodney buying the mentioned ties. The man was confused and could not explain it. But the most terrifying find was a note in Rodney's apartment. It was a farewell letter in which he wrote about his intention to kill Morgan and then himself, leaving the children orphaned. The woman miraculously managed to save herself by using psychological manipulation, which stopped the criminal and made him change his mind. Perhaps Rodney decided that not all was lost and he would be able to reconcile with his ex-wife. It was this illusory hope of reuniting that actually saved Morgan's life. Among the most valuable evidence was a video from the facade of Rodney's apartment building. It did not show anyone approaching the window and writing Morgan's name on the glass. But the suspect himself returned home shortly after the attack. He spent about 4 minutes in the apartment, probably changing clothes and getting rid of physical evidence. Leaving the building before returning to the victim's home, Rodney was holding a black bag. Later, he threw it away. Unfortunately, the investigation failed to find this potentially important piece of evidence. A day later, Rodney was arrested for the second time. This time, a whole range of other charges was added to the violation of privacy charges: unlawful entry, property damage, possession of a firearm, robbery, assault with aggravating circumstances involving torture and strangulation, burglary, kidnapping, and rape. The suspect was held in custody without the right to bail. And the day after the charges were brought, Morgan came to the police station with her friend Nicole. The woman was no longer sure that it was Rodney who had attacked her. The reason for the doubts was new manipulation on his part. While behind bars, the man contacted Morgan and tried to convince her that he had become a victim of slander. Allegedly, his ex-wife was accusing him of terrible crimes that he was supposedly incapable of committing. This demonstrated the degree of destructive influence that Rodney exerted on Morgan even after everything that had happened. The woman suffered serious physical and psychological trauma as a result of the attack. She had to wait for all the wounds to heal before picking up the children from her parents. Ahead, Morgan faced a difficult conversation with the twins, during which she had to explain why their dad would no longer be around. For long months, The woman was tormented by nightmares about the violence she had experienced. Sometimes she could not find the strength to even take the children to school, afraid of being left alone in the house. The prosecutors had enough evidence against Rodney to secure a severe punishment. But to spare Morgan additional suffering during the trial, a plea bargain was proposed. 8 months later, on August 4, 2021, Rodney Metzger pleaded guilty to 14 counts related to the attack on his ex-wife. He was sentenced to 70 years in prison with the right to parole after 25 years. The rest of the term would be served on probation. In fact, this meant that Rodney would be under police supervision for the rest of his life. Interestingly, the man himself forbade visits to the prison even for his own mother. He does not want her to see her son behind bars. The woman is very worried because after the start of the imprisonment, Rodney's health rapidly deteriorated, particularly due to diagnosed diabetes. However, it is expected that he will be released in 2046. Morgan underwent therapy and largely recovered from the horror she experienced. She obtained a ban for her ex-husband to meet with the children. But this measure turned out to be unnecessary. The twins themselves show no interest in communicating with their father. They can hardly remember what he looks like. Please write your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. For those who are new here, subscribing is the best way to stay updated on future content. Also give a like please. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Thank you for your support during this difficult time. Until next time, friends.